So good morning to everybody. It's going to be a long day today. If you don't have this program, it's on the table outside. You can have it and you can see how it will proceed. And I would like to ask if there's any question from anything that is not clear. What we're going to do today, everything is on the program, and we're going to follow the program strictly, even with Brian's lecture. So I will ask Diederick here to come and replace me in the moderation, because I have some trivial things always, to take care for, so everything will run smoothly. So thank you all, and let's start the day.
Thank you very much, Neni. Apologies for this slightly rough start of the day, but this will be the first session of the conference proper after the opening roundtable of last night. They set the tone, the panelists of last night, for the whole theme, the friction between science and policy. What we're going to do, we have 3 sessions, one this morning, one this afternoon, and one tomorrow morning. And the last one tomorrow will be followed by another roundtable like last night. In the first session, we shall look at what brought us into the current situation with science and policy and all the frictions on both sides and between them, how we got there, and why it is what it is now. Then in the second session this afternoon, we'll give you some current examples from various areas of science and policy. And in the third session tomorrow, we'll ask the question, how do we move on from here? So briefly, you could say it's the past, the present, and the future, session 1, 2, and 3. It's not quite correct, but you can think of it that way. So let's start this session. We have 3 speakers, 2 before coffee, 1 after coffee, and after the third one, we have a discussion round. So we don't have discussion at the end of each talk, although, of course, I think the speakers will allow you to interrupt them if something is really not clear. Then put up your hand and ask them either during the talk or after. But questions and reactions to the content of the talk, please save them until the discussion just before lunch at the end of the morning. Then we have 3/4 of an hour for discussion about all 3 talks. Okay, the first talk will be from Professor Brian Wynne. He is from Scotland. He started his career with an MA in natural sciences and a PhD in material science, both from Cambridge University, then got a Master of Philosophy in the Sociology of Science in Edinburgh. And his work after that has covered technology and risk assessment, public risk perceptions, and public understanding of science, focusing on the relations between expert and lay knowledge and policy decision-making. He was an inaugural member of the Management Board and the Scientific Committee of the European Environment Agency, the EEA, the publishers of Late Lessons from Early Warnings, that was quoted from yesterday. He was a special advisor to the House of Lords Science and Technology Select Committee inquiry into science and society in 2000. And he's also a member of the London Royal Society's Committee on Science in Society. Last but not least, he's one of the founding members of ENSSER. Brian, I hope you're ready. We shall try to keep track of the slides with you. And I'll remind you 5 minutes before your time.
My title is, for this morning, is how has science come to be recognized and institutionalized as a public policy resource in the past 80 years? We think about 80 years from backwards from now, we're talking about after the end of the Second World War, or late 40s, 1950-ish, onwards to the present. And the reason I start here is basically because one of the huge points in that kind of recent history, mid-20th century to the present, that we often overlook and are kind of blinded to by the frenzy that's been in front of us for pretty well all that time. I don't want to dwell on the recent past, but that period is my focus. And the reason I start there is because actually when we talk about science and policy, it really only becomes meaningful from that time to the present. And it becomes meaningful in particular ways. First of all, actually, early 20th century, there was virtually nothing that was called policy. And the same goes for science. It was natural philosophy. And it was in the discipline that I studied at uni and then continued researching in, physics and chemistry and materials, but physics in particular, early 20th century, when a very esoteric issue appeared in the midst of the then emerging quantum theory, which was all then about atomic structure and electromagnetic radiation, the so-called wave-particle dualism. And scientists realized a very curious, paradoxical thing, that actually if they began experiments, laboratory experiments, on the assumption that electromagnetic radiation was radiation as we tend to think of it, i.e. waveform, continuous waveform of varying, systematically varying intensity, then you set up the experiment according to that assumption, and you find waveform radiation. So, for example, diffraction through different materials. If you actually do the opposite and set the experimental apparatus up, you design the experimental apparatus differently on the assumption that electromagnetic radiation is particle form or corpuscular, as they called it in those days, then you actually find that the energy actually operates as particles or corpuscular fashion, where there's no waveform at all, but the energy in the electromagnetic radiation comes in pulses, completely separated, but in very precise coordinated form and regular form from all the other corpuscles of energy in the electromagnetic radiation form. So this was very puzzling, and nobody could understand the point, which has been elaborated much more by historians, philosophers, and even scientists themselves, sociologists of science like myself, that actually it's true that actually when you're doing scientific experimental observation of nature, you're not only passively observing, because the act of observation itself requires energy. And basically, when you get down to quantum level intra-atomic structural processes and so on, then the energy transaction required to observe it is on the same scale as what you're trying to observe. Therefore, the observation affects the structure and processes of what you're observing. Representing is intervening. That's the key point, which Ian Hacking in the 1980s, Canadian philosopher of science, actually began to elaborate and found documented himself in various domains of science. It's a point that still is not understood in practicing science. during my PhD at Cambridge in the early 1970s, no one ever talked about anything like that. We did not even understand that was a question. The point is, that was solved in the late 1920s by basically the move to instrumentalism. Instead of trying to represent nature, physics, quantum physics, made advances and survived as quantum physics by deciding that we did not need to represent nature accurately. What we needed to do was to predict and control. Only predict and control. And if our predictions are shown to be working, then in the laboratory experiments, then we basically have scientific truth. Forget reality lying behind. That doesn't matter. What matters is that predictions actually are accurate.
Brian, are you actually following your slides?
No, not at all. But then I rarely do, Diederick. So let me
slide do you want to be on now?
Come back to the point. There's an important point there, which is relevant for all of this conference, all of ENSSER, all of risk assessment and regulation of science and technology, and for science and policy. But let me try to make some sense of my PowerPoint. But the important point about writing or constructing a PowerPoint like this is not for me to speak to it, because there's far too much in here for me to speak to it in 20, 30 minutes. The important point is that you, as participants, can actually take it away, and if you're interested in it, read it afterwards and make sense of what I've been saying. And I'm sorry I could not therefore have sent it earlier, but yesterday even I was still amending PowerPoints, adding ones and so on, and Parole Lucas was dealing with that. So in outline, the crucial points I want to make here are that firstly, when we think about science and policy, and as I've already justified the time frame that I'm actually focusing on here, we have to remember or get some sense of, because it's not really right to say remember it, we weren't there and we didn't see it happening at the time. The important point is the amount of sheer innovation which took place and investment in science following the Second World War. The Second World War is generally regarded as the war in which, or the event in which, science was central and science won. So not only were the Hiroshima and Nagasaki war crimes committed with nuclear weapons, but also everywhere else. I mean, missiles were new. Almost every weapon that was exercised in the Second World War, along with many that had been there for centuries, it's generally regarded is that science won the war for the Allies. Whether that's true, we can argue forever, but it's certainly true that they were central. And after the war, science was seen as it. If we want to restore the kind of wealth we had, but actually generate lots more through economic growth, technological innovation, all the rest of it, we must have science. So many innovations were generated from scientific laboratories through that following decade or more, and continued. And we're still in that frenzy now, just with new technologies or different technologies, or perhaps more accurately, promises of new technologies that still have not delivered. Maybe they'll deliver disaster, maybe they'll deliver utopia, who knows? But lots of them still haven't delivered, and they're being treated as if real by financial institutions and all the rest of that political economic structure. And that's what brings them into being, even if they're completely different from the original promises and imaginaries of them, which were created for the benefit of investors. or for the persuasion of investors, I should say. So I'm going to jump to this particular slide, which is number 4 for whoever is managing it in Athens. Have you got this slide up, which is a graphic of knowledge and innovation life cycles?
Yes.
Great, thanks. This is what we need to look at for now. So this is my attempt to schematically represent those processes which were generating and are still generating innovations, but there's a dimension to this diagram which should be there, which is in the R&D funding, or what I call the top left of that diagram, the upstream processes. This is a schematic knowledge innovation life cycle. What I should now add to this, and I'll do this at some point in the near future, it should now read knowledge innovation and financing or investment life cycles. And it's more complex. I'll have to work this out. This life cycle runs from R&D funding, which is basically motivated and dominated by promises, expectations, and selective social interests. It was only selective social interests that generated nuclear weapons. There was an awful lot of R&D that went on in the 20s and 30s, 1930s, 1940s, that led to nuclear weapons as a practical technology. And the same is true for many others. Then we have science-led innovation, still upstream. And then we have impacts, we have uses, of course, and we have impacts and risks. The bottom right of this diagram is the only element of this whole life cycle for pretty well every life cycle of innovation that you care to think about, whichever particular one you want to choose. That actually it's the bottom right, the very downstream or back end of that life cycle. Social impacts have already hit or are beginning to hit from innovation processes. Material innovations are actually hitting the world before risk assessment as the sole focus of social assessment, and actually the sole frame of recognized meaning. And through my talk and Erik's talk, which follows, and indeed Irina's afterwards, the whole point that risk assessment or risk, health, security, environmental health too, the very downstream back end impacts of those innovations, which began decades before, very often in the form of funding with promises and expectations and hopes driving them. It's a long time after that risk assessment and all the rest of it, the controversies and the risk assessment policy and the risk management and the risk communication that Erik will talk about to us, that these risk assessment processes actually begin to occur. So there's a whole political economy prior to what we focus on in regulatory, supposedly democratic government processes. Risk assessment still remains virtually the only focus. It's the only question which is asked, risk. And what's more, in those processes which have developed since the Second World War, largely, of social assessment of technology, it's the only focus that there is given to them. And in fact, many regulatory bodies, many scientific bodies, the Royal Society of London, the various global equivalents around the world, including, the Soviet, as it used to be, Academy of Sciences in Moscow, now the Russian Academy of Sciences, that's the way they do their public, such as it is in Moscow. That's the way they do their public assessment of science. It's only about risk. there are many, many other questions in innovation and indeed in the R&D funding that should be being asked. And one of the only governments which has ever even contemplated doing this, which has it in law that it's required by regulatory bodies to be done, is actually the Norwegian government in its 1996 Gene Technology Act, where it required not only risk assessment to be done, the after the fact processes of risk assessment, but actually the other rational questions which should be being asked in a publicly accountable way about those innovations. So, for example, what benefits are supposed to be being generated by those innovations? For whom? And have those benefits in, when we've actually had so much experience now of that innovation in process, what benefits have actually occurred in comparison with the promises which were made in order to get those investments out of usually private investment. Sometimes government, as for example, originally with nuclear power, no longer basically it's all private investment trying to persuade big global corporations to invest in those technologies for their own shareholder profits. So it's dominated nowadays by private political economic interests, corporations which either are already or want to be global and want to be bigger and want to gain monopolies, where the so-called ideology of this is free markets, free markets, free markets. Free markets are a fiction. They always have been and always will be. And they're more of a fiction now than even they were back when they were being initiated. So there's a story here which I want to emphasize, which runs right through this presentation and I hope the conference, which is science and policy when we talk about it. And we do this too often in ENSSER, in our own private conversations, wherever that might be, is that science and policy only covers this tiny back end, bottom right-hand corner of this schematic representation of knowledge, innovation, and investment life cycles. And that central part, science-led innovation, is preceded now by promises which are made by scientists in R&D labs, usually nowadays corporate private R&D labs, which vastly, and I've got a figure somewhere in this, you can find it if I don't get to it, because I think I'm already running out of time. The crucial point here is that this knowledge and innovation is preceded by corporate investment, and that if I could, I'm going to have to run to this and jump to it and see if I can find it, which I'm not going to do. Yeah, there it is. And I'm sorry, but when I loaded this, for some reason, when I transferred it from the document, it's actually a US, no, this is actually a World Bank document, would you believe? And let me just explain what these figures are. First of all, you should see on this diagram, the horizontal axis, the x-axis as we call it, the horizontal axis on this figure is actually just time. So left hand, you probably can't see my cursor because I think that's just at home. But left hand is actually 1950 or late 40s. And right hand, this is just linear time across the left to right of this figure.
Ryan.
Sorry, it's number 21 on my file anyway, Lucas, if you have it there. And the right-hand side is about 2020, 2022. So think of the middle as around about the 1980s. So let me just explain the color scheme on these with these. There's actually four, but ignore the light blue. It's not relevant. The dark blue, the top one in the figure, is actually the total of the red and the orange or yellow, whatever you want to call it. The red is actually government funding of R&D. And this is, as you see on the y-axis or the vertical axis, this is percentage of GDP, R&D figures, aggregated over, I think it's World Bank, so whatever you include in the World Bank's constituency. The red figure is actually government funding or public funding, and the blue, the blue's total, and the yellow is the private corporate R&D funding. So as you can see, government funding until about 1980, interestingly, the beginning of Monte Pelerin and the neoliberal front, which began in the 1980s, but that's when, roundabout when, private corporate R&D funding began to overtake and vastly overtake. As you can see, currently, private corporate R&D funding exceeds public funding by a factor of roughly 4 or 5. In 1980, that's when private corporate R&D funding began to exceed public funding, and public funding has just basically gradually declined over that period. So I'm sorry that the figure itself, for some reason, they disappeared and I didn't have time to re-find them and reinsert them. So we're talking about a very big shift over that period from the dominance of science, and this is still called science. Let's not forget that. Science is just as much private corporate science as it is public funding. And the whole point about corporate science is that it's actually integrated into, it both drives and is driven by the vast amounts of material power and financial power, economic power, and political power. Because don't forget that these days, and this is increased incessantly the more that we've had neoliberalism with us ruling the world and shaping the world, that actually the science and the material, political, economic power are mutually reinforcing. And that's a crucial point. When we talk about science and policy, we're still talking about it as if science were independent and policy follows whatever science is telling us is the best scientific advice, the best new technologies that might be available or are available already, as the promises go, just invest the money in this. And so this is the crucial point about this figure, that corporate R&D funding has not only increased, but it's increased in conjunction with political and economic power. So we like to think of democratic governments, insofar as we can still talk about those these days. Democratic governments are basically also following corporate R&D, because each democratic government, governments at large in the world, are desperate for big corporate investment, which far exceeds state resources and state investments, because we're not allowed to talk about taxes and raising public resources in order to do more of that. But that's a story I can't get into now, except I'm into it in any case. So I just want to give one, I think I'm going to find it's, this is an extract. This is slide 24, if I can just guide you to it, Lucas. So this is actually an article in Nature Biotechnology of 2004 by John Mack, who himself is a scientist, but also these days, I think, call him a science communicator. The research and development which is being done, this is talking about molecular biology and systems biology, then a new field developing from molecular biology and biotech, bioresearch. That the point about the investigation of the molecular level was that the whole point of it was what we were looking for at the molecular level, indeed now submolecular level, to speed up drug discovery and development and to make it much more efficient, and to use information from disparate data sets to create computational models that can describe and predict phenotype at the cell, tissue, or organismal level, so as to assist commercial drug development. For systems biologists to come up with tangible results to show to investors, in other words, to make those promises that will attract the investment. And this is the point, that the science itself is structured epistemically at micro level, right down to molecular biology and DNA level and RNA level and so on, which is that actually the scientific knowledge is structured in conjunction with these material, political, economic factors. We can no longer realistically or meaningfully talk about science and policy. It's still implying that they're separate domains just informing each other, or the one informing the other. In other words, science informs and does not influence in any other way than by rational choices of the best science. Whether we're talking about production science, innovation-oriented, or whether we're talking about protection-oriented science, i.e. regulation, risk assessment, and all of that. This is the upstream end. And so I'm going to have to stop there. And I'm sorry that there's far too much, as you can see in this slide, a lot of it is yet further illustration of this point, that Mac is not making the point except inadvertently in what he's just talking about as a scientist, as to why we're doing this and what's driving our investigation of molecular biology and RNA, DNA, and all the rest of it that goes on at that level and beneath that level. So somebody, I think it was Ole, admitted last night, or confessed last night, Ole, that you are a pessimist. I'd like to join you in that. In fact, I've been there for a very long time. The more I've got to know about science, originally as a practitioner of science, which I enjoyed doing in my naivety, material science was already in the 1970s beholden, as I realized, which is why I switched and went to learn about my trade from the outside rather than just doing it from the inside. Basically, because when I was offered to do a postdoc research fellowship in material science at one of the leading departments of material science in the world, I began to realize that actually the things I wanted to research, the oil crisis had just begun with Sheikh Yamani, whichever Gulf state he was in, threatening the West with a doubling of the oil price over like 2 years or so, because we, the oil sheikhs or the Gulf states, now rule the world in oil. We dominate production of global oil. And so they were basically threatening to get one back on the colonial West, which had been running the Gulf states for the benefit of cheap oil and gasoline for cars at whatever it was then, 10 cents, 20 cents a dollar, a gallon or whatever it was. So that was what led to the vast expansion of nuclear power at that time. Again, promises or threats, one might say, as distinct from any kind of actuality nuclear power. The UK CGB alone promised, this was government backed, and they were running the government in that respect in terms of energy policy in those days and right through actually. But basically the CGB, the Central Electricity Generating Board, then a state authority, basically promised that they would build 36 nuclear reactors over the space of 5 years. And the promise rather fell flat just through the usual things, practicalities. Who's going to generate the finance for that? What are the lead times going to be? All the usual questions. So talking about pessimism, this is my final word. This is Michael Taussig, who was then an anthropologist of the Amazon area, South America. He was at Columbia University. He was talking about his research in the Colombian rainforest and in Colombian indigenous societies, where coca, of course, is a daily normal public commodity and used by almost everyone. The Gold Museum, highly recommended if anyone is thinking ever of going there. Fabulous place. But as Taussig pointed out, a lot of the objects on offer at the Bogota Gold Museum can actually be seen to have deposits of coke and coke ingestion or inhalation, a bit of both, in the form of saliva deposits which dry and solidify on the gold of those wonderfully elaborate items in the museum. And they're not talked about, of course, because that's the coca. So this is why, as you see at the bottom, Taussig entitles his book, talking about the Bogota Gold Museum, My Cocaine Museum, because it's a museum also of coca. And it's an invisible museum in that respect, celebrating nothing about the work and the society and the intelligence and also the exploitation and violence that was committed on those invisible people in the Colombian rainforest who actually produced the gold for the rich people, who then eventually, it passed anyway into public ownership, I guess. I'm not sure about that, the Bogota Gold Museum. So Taussig is talking about that invisible society. And I want us to think about and work out a language for talking realistically and properly and critically about that upstream dimension of the innovation life cycle that we basically are silenced from talking about. We need first to develop the intellectual resources and the political resources to talk about it and to intervene in it. And so Taussig finishes in a rather pessimistic fashion. What then of Frederick Jameson's notion? Jameson was a 1940s, 50s or so, very eminent linguistics expert. Frederick Jameson stated back in that time, 1950s, I think this book was, that it's easier to imagine the end of the planet than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. I'll finish with those words. I'd like to think Jameson's wrong and Taussig's wrong, but it's a question, and it's lying in the back and maybe in the front of our minds as we go through this conference and as we go home and continue with our work wherever. I still have hope, even if hope is irrational. Hope springs eternal, and I have hope, and that's why I'm here talking to you and listening to you. And I hope that we can enjoy our conference. Thank you. I'm sorry, I probably haven't allowed discussion time.
That's all right. That's all right. We're doing it that way. You'll get discussion after Irina's talk.
Yeah.
So,
okay. Fine. Yeah, that's great. Yeah,
great.
because these three hang together anyway, and I'm very dependent on Erik and Irina for what,
right,
if anything, of value sits in this presentation anyway. So thank you very much for being patient and listening, and I look forward to the discussion and to Erik and Irina's interventions.
Thank you for sharing the insights of your big brain. Thanks very much again. I realize I failed to introduce myself with this chaotic start. I'm sorry. My name is Diederick Sprangers. I am the scientific coordinator of ENSSER. Let's get on to the second talk. I'm looking for Professor Erik. Oh, there he is. You went there, Erik. Professor Erik Millstone. He is a professor of science policy, and he started by getting a first degree in physics, followed by 3 postgraduate degrees in philosophy. And then he became a lecturer at the University of Sussex in history and social studies of science, and joined the science policy research unit of that university in 1987, became a senior lecturer and then a reader, and now a professor or emeritus professor of science policy.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak. And I feel that it is incumbent on me as a native speaker, English speaker, to thank everyone that the meeting is conducted in English. Too often, British people take for granted that everyone else speaks English. I don't take that for granted. I'm also taking quite a large risk this morning because I was struck yesterday evening when, I think it was Professor Zerafos said, mixing science and politics is never good. I am going to offer, and when he said that, there was quite a lot of applause in the room. I am going to contest that view. I'm going to give a contrary narrative, not about the totality of science, but in particular about science insofar as it serves as providing advice to policymakers. In the context of policymaking to regulate technologies, science is invariably politicized, I shall argue, but I'm also going to argue that the way it is currently politicized is, in many respects, dishonest and unaccountable. I'm arguing that they cannot be fully separated, and the appropriate response, therefore, is to do it in a transparent and accountable way. And that would be my argument. And I have allegedly control over this. This is my title. Let's get on with it. Oh, yeah. To a good first approximation, I mean, I've had the benefit that many of you haven't had, that I've already received Brian's slides a couple of days ago, read through them, and I interpret Brian's main narrative about the scientization of politics in the 20th century, and I'm going to be talking about the politicalization of science, starting actually a bit earlier in the late. I'm going to talk at a quite high level of generality about a range of, about the typical characteristics of the institutional relationships between scientific advisors and policymaking across a wide range of different technology regulatory matters. I've listed some of them there: climate change, mobile phones, pharmaceuticals. If you could read the top words there, you would see it says scientific and democratic legitimacy are radically different. And I take that as axiomatic. And indeed, some have argued, and I won't get into textual details, and so some argue that they are fundamentally incompatible. And I think a lot of scientists assume that they are incompatible. I believe that they are different, but they can coexist and be reconciled, but only under very specific sets of conditions, and it's to try to characterize those conditions that I'm attempting to do today. And where should I point which machine should I point this bleeper to make the slides move. Okay. And yeah. The context in which that I'm addressing is specifically, it's not science in general, it's not academic science, it's that quite distinct form of science that occurs in the context of official regulatory institutions, national governments, and in the European context, of course, the European Commission. And it's, I'm saying, and I call this, and I'm not alone in this, I call it regulatory science. And regulatory science is, I maintain, importantly different from a lot of academic science. In academic science, as I indicate on the slide, what typically happens is that one pursues areas of uncertainty and ignorance and tries to diminish those uncertainties and ignorance. But in doing so, one inevitably comes across further areas of uncertainty and ignorance. And academic science typically opens things up. But that is not what regulatory science is about. Regulatory science is supposed to close things down, not open them up. When governments, the European Commission, recruit scientists to be advisors, they want those official advisors to settle questions and shut down debate so that more questions are not asked in order to give the appearance of authority to those policy judgments. And in that respect, regulatory science is quite unlike academic science. Yes. Government ministers and European commissioners want their scientific advisors to provide specific policy recommendations, not a list of uncertainties and alternative options. I was once interviewing a senior official who provides a secretariat to expert advisory committees, and she said, the one thing I cannot allow my committee to say is, we don't know. That's completely useless. Ministers and governments want what my colleague Andy Sterling illuminatingly calls monolithic prescriptive advice. Follow this course of action, not plural and conditional advice. I like the old story of the government minister who has his officials bring to him the chair of the expert advisory committee, and the minister says to the chair of the committee, tell me, Professor, is it safe? And the professor says, well, Minister, on the one hand, there's these studies which don't suggest any harm. On the other hand, there are these other studies that suggest harm. And the minister turns to the official and says, can't you get me a one-handed scientist? And that reflects, that's a joke, but it reflects a reality. That's what ministers want. Oh yes, I don't repeat gossip, so I'll say this only once. When the UK Food Standards Agency was created, they appointed Professor John Krebs, son of the Krebs that Ulrich was referring to yesterday, as the first chair of the agency, and the Secretary of State for Health invited him in, and as he came into the room, I wasn't there, but people who were tell me, the minister stood up, put out his hand and said, Professor, I will never hesitate to use you as my shield. So this is what politicians want. They want scientists to take responsibility for difficult contestable decisions so that ministers can say, as they often do, and they certainly did in the UK during the mad cow disease crisis, we are doing what and only what our scientists advise. Therefore, and it is not for me as a mere politician to second guess the science or for any non-expert to challenge or question it. So my approach today is to offer a historical sequence of 4 models in terms of which the relationships between science and policy making have been conceptualized. And I'm going to say the first three models have been influential, officially endorsed, but misleading. Yes, if you'd seen all of Brian's slides, you'd have seen he refers to them as functional myths, and I think that's what these models are. Okay. I do contend, so I'm going to criticize the first three models, and then provide you with a fourth model, which I believe accurately captures how the relations really work, but it's only rarely been officially endorsed and never effectively implemented. But if it were implemented, then policy decisions could achieve and reconcile both scientific and democratic legitimacy. Okay. Well, so let's jump to it. Okay, so this is the first model. And this developed actually back in the late 19th century, and you'll find it articulated initially in the writings of Emil Durkheim and Max Weber, and they were theorizing the role of official advisors in governments in what to them was then a modern industrial society. And I do not have full remission of symptoms from having studied philosophy for many years. And so, especially now that I'm in Athens, I should say that this model resonates strongly with the account provided by the philosopher who the British call Aristotle, and I believe in Greek is pronounced Aristoteles. I'm not certain of that, if that's the correct pronunciation, but that was his account of practical action. And it's simply a contrast between and a sequence between choosing the ends or the goals of policy, which is a political decision, and there's an expert, a role for officials and experts to work out the means by which those goals can be reached. Oh, sorry, not that. Yeah, that way. So, where's me? So, for those of you who are less colorblind than me, it's important that you notice that I'm using the color red to convey the warmth, or is it heat, of politics, and blue to convey the cooler, less heated characteristics of science. So that on this model, values and interests and politics comes first and science follows. And this is how the role of experts and officials was initially conceptualized in the late 19th, early 20th century. But it was then critiqued by scientists and by philosophers too, who said, no, this is an inadequate model. So, and it's easy to see why they criticize this, because there are many, many important technology regulatory issues which only arise on the agenda because of the work of scientists. Government ministers on their own didn't know anything about climate change, damage to the ozone layer, the toxicity of asbestos, the toxicity of many other compounds, or the risks of technology. So you can't leave it to policymakers to choose the goals because they don't have the requisite knowledge. And what came in its place, it was a positivist technocratic model, which I represent in this one, that somehow scientists have the facts, and scientific facts on their own are not just necessary, but sufficient to decide policy. Leave it to the experts. They know best. And that is a narrative which prevailed in the USA until the 70s, but it survived in Europe and the UK. But sorry, I'm a British person who counts Britain as a European country, just to avoid confusion. Yes, so I gave the example before of ministers saying, we are doing what and only what our expert advisors tell us. That's an exemplification of this kind of narrative, but it's not satisfactory, it's not convincing, it's not persuasive, because the science is not certain. There are enormous uncertainties in the scientific basis of much of the evidence upon which policies are based. The reason the model, the technocratic model broke down in the US had nothing to do with science or regulatory policy. It was a consequence of a scandal during the Vietnam War. What was it? Oh yes, it was called the Pentagon Papers. Disclosed that despite repeated assertions of the contrary, it turned out the US government was bombing Kampuchea. And this provoked Congress into introducing a vital piece of information called the Freedom of Information Act, which applied across many fields of public policy, including the scientific basis of technology regulatory policy. And as soon as it was open to public scrutiny, it was quite clear that the science was not definitive, that there were uncertainties, and therefore scientific facts alone can never determine policy. Oh yeah. So that narrative is very attractive, as it appeals to policymakers because it shields them from responsibility, and it flatters scientists because it influences it flatters their sense of intellectual and cultural authority. And it broke down in Europe much later, and I maintain that was mostly because of the mad cow disease. Okay. Yes, it was torpedoed by uncertainties. Yet, in the early years of the mad cow disease crisis, initially British government officials and ministers, but also then European officials, commissioners, repeatedly said, science has shown for certain that BSE, mad cow disease pathogen, cannot transmit to humans and cause harm. And indeed, they used this extremely inept phrase. They referred to the cattle as a dead-end host, a phrase that came back to haunt them. Yes, because it actually quite rapidly spread to zoo animals that had been, the first animal that wasn't cattle that succumbed to spongiform encephalopathy from eating contaminated feed was referred to as Mad Max the cat in Bristol. But then a sequence of other species succumbed, and the assertion of certainty just evaporated. The case of saccharin is what long fascinated me. Saccharin has been permitted in food supply in US and Europe since the late 19th century, about 1892, and has been controversial since about 1896. And there have been multiple controversies about possible kinds of toxicity, but it culminated in the 70s when some studies on rodents, rats in particular, showed that at not particularly high doses, saccharin consumption resulted in statistically significant increase in bladder cancer in male rats. And then other kinds of tests developed. And in desperation, the US and National Academy of Sciences tried to put an upper or lower bound on the risk that saccharin might pose to the US population. And they estimated that over the next 70 years, which was then the average lifespan of US citizens, consuming the average levels of saccharin that were consumed, and it's not just in food, it's also in toothpaste. Many of you have already had some this morning when you brushed your teeth, be that as it may, that the extra deaths that might arise in the US population over 70 years might be as low as 0.22, which corresponds to 1 death every 350 years, which is not humanly negligible, at least politically negligible. Or it might be as high as 1,444,000. It's somewhere in there. That was about as precise as it could get. And that was in the 70s, since when the uncertainty has increased. As a wider range of different studies have come up with conflicting answers. So science in policy rarely speaks with one voice or certainty. And even if scientific uncertainties could be eliminated, scientific fact will never determine regulatory policy choices. As I was taught as a philosophy graduate student, the slogan in English is, you cannot derive an ought from an is. Facts on their own will never determine policies, but policies always presuppose some values, and once you're involved in policy making, values cannot but intrude. So the technocratic model broke down, and this is the current conventional wisdom, the current prevailing orthodoxy. Oh, it's called the Red Book because it was first published by US National Academy of Sciences volume in the 70s, and it was bound in a red cover. So it's gone by that name ever since. And it's a sort of inverted model of the Durkheim-Weber model. Instead of politics first and science second, it's science first and politics second. And first, science is deemed to provide risk assessments, a scientific assessment of risk, which is then, and that information is then passed to officials and ministers, risk managers, and they can appropriately introduce non-scientific considerations, values, interests, practicalities, costs of acting, costs of not acting, and so on, and make policy judgments. Now, a noticeable feature of all of those three models is that they are linear and unidirectional. So in this model, yes, science influences policy, but policy doesn't influence science. So whether that counts as science and policy mixing, I don't know, but it is at least linear and unidirectional. But this is, as I say, now the prevailing orthodoxy. It's the way in which the US government speaks, the European Commission speaks, and pretty much all the governments of European Union and many, many other countries. It's embodied in OECD manuals, for managing technology and so on. But, oh yeah, I've said all that, okay. But I think the model is flawed in crucial respects, which is that in practice, all scientific assessments are necessarily framed by some prior value-laden, context-depending assumptions. And recently, new terminology has developed, and these assumptions are being called, and I think it's an illuminating way of referring to them, they're called risk assessment policy assumptions, which, for the purpose of trying not to clutter the screen up, I summarize as abbreviators, RAPs. And I say, and I'm not alone in this by any stretch of the imagination, but in practice, the way that science operates in realistic policy-making context is it's, as it were, sandwiched between two value-based steps, one upstream and one downstream. So this is the fourth model, in which, yes, science plays a crucial role. You've got an expert assessment which draws on scientific considerations, but the way in which that's the scientific risk assessment is conducted is itself dependent on certain prior upstream value-laden policy judgments. And I maintain that there are at least 3 different kinds of those judgments. They, as it were, structure, as I then frame the risk assessment, and then that is passed to policymakers that then make risk management decisions of the kind I was referring to earlier. But a distinctive feature of this model is that it is not unidirectional. There are reciprocal interactions, both conceptual and practical. I was interviewing a senior official at the European Commission about setting up the European Food Safety Authority. First, okay, I'll complete that anecdote first before leaping to the second. And I asked the official, once the European Food Safety Authority is set up, how do you here in Brussels in the Commission anticipate will be the relationship between the Commission and the European Food Safety Authority? And I got the wonderful answer. We want it to be independent, but not out of control. Subsequently, talking to people at the European Food Safety Authority, I asked them, are there negotiations between the scientific body, EFSA, and the European Commission in advance of the European Food Safety Authority conducting an assessment? And I got the very interesting answer, oh yes, we have extensive discussions, and those discussions could often take 2 or 3 or 4 months. And what doesn't happen, it's not that policymakers ask simple questions of their experts. They usually craft the questions with enormous care, in part because they want to receive the advice that they've already decided they want to receive. And therefore the question has to be crafted in such a way. And so one of the things I've discovered in relation to chemicals in the food supply is they will often say, not, please assess this chemical and look at all the evidence and make a judgment. It's often framed much more narrowly, much more narrowly. So it's often something like, has any scientific study been published since you last reviewed it, which on its own is sufficient to persuade you to change the advice you gave last time? And as you can see, that's a much more tightly constrained question, and a question which reflects certain political and commercial interests. And it's not a generalized scientific question. It's highly context dependent. Okay. Part of my complaint about this model, and let's go back to it, is this is the way it works, but it masquerades in these terms. So actually what's happening is that all this area, this upstream area, the framing assumption, the risk of policy, is all out of sight and left implicit and is unaccountable. And this seems to me part of the serious flaw in the system, that in practice, well, sometimes risk assessment policy assumptions are embodied in legislation. So for instance, in relation to pesticides in the European Union, the legislation specifies that the role of the scientific assessors is to assess the toxicity of individual active compounds, not commercial products. But that doesn't preclude the expert advisors from exploring possible interactions between active ingredients and other ingredients in formulated products, but they typically avoid doing so because that would make their life too difficult and too contestable. What's really happening, but most of these underlying framing assumptions are not embodied in literature, but are left to the chosen scientific advisors to presume for themselves. But what emerges from these official risk assessments is a hybrid synthesis of both scientific and non-scientific considerations, but it masquerades as if it was purely scientific. But an absolutely crucial feature of the problematic element in these systems is that industrial corporations have captured many of the scientific panels and their members. And very often, the scientists themselves participating in the process, who are typically nominated by large industrial corporations, make normative value judgments without even recognizing that they're doing so. Let me give you an example. One of the very good features, one of the few very good features of the way in which the British Food Standards Agency operates is that it is now the case that all expert advisory committees are required to meet in public most of the time, not quite all. But it just enabled me to attend some meetings. And at one meeting of the Committee on Toxicity, it started in the normal way whereby they go around the room and each member of the committee declares if they have any commercial conflicts of interest. And one person at the start of the meeting acknowledged that he's a paid consultant to the Chemical Industry Association. But nobody cared about that. And then an hour later in the meeting, an item on the agenda arose about an active pesticide ingredient on which there was some new evidence of possible carcinogenicity. At which point, the individual who declared the interest in the chemical industry said, we, the committee must remember that we have a special responsibility to avoid a false positive. I was the only person in the room shocked by that. All the others sort of nodded, yes, that's right. But hang on, you're here. Sorry, these were the thoughts going through my head, look. Because I wasn't, visitors were allowed to speak, but not until the end of the meeting, after all the decisions had been taken. The thought went through my head, no, hang on. If you say we must go out of our way to avoid a false positive, that is tantamount to saying we must give the benefit of the doubt to the commercial company and their commercial compounds. And I thought, hang on, you're supposed to be here to protect public and environmental health. If anything, you should prioritize avoiding false negatives, not false positives. But when the statement was made, it was a clear value judgment, and the person who made it was, it seemed, entirely unaware that it was a value judgment, and neither any of the other members of the committee or the officials providing the secretariat to that meeting. So that it was just one example of the way in which commercial influences can penetrate into the deliberations of these committees. Anyway, okay. Let's get on with it. I maintain there are at least three main types of underlying risk assessment policy assumptions. I call them substantive, procedural, and interpretive. Okay, substantive. What counts as a risk? I mean, let's be clear. you can't, as a European Commissioner or a government minister, you can't say to the committee, assess all possible risks. You mean for all time, to all species? No, that's unrealistic. It has to be framed more narrowly, but how narrowly? I'll give you a couple of examples of the ways in which assessments are narrowly framed. Let's take mobile telephony. I would be surprised if there were many people in the room here who don't have a mobile phone. And mobile phones work with microwave radiation. And we all know that microwave radiation can have thermal effects. That's how the microwave oven works. So the question arose quite reasonably, if you put a mobile phone next to your head in order to have a conversation, does the microwave radiation coming to and from your phone adversely affect the temperature of your head and your brain? That's a perfectly reasonable question. And it has been assessed. And the answer seems to be, well, the difference between making a phone call and putting the phone away has less impact on the temperature of your head than putting a hat on or taking a hat off. So it's not a significant worry. But maybe that's not the only kind of effect. Microwave radiation can have electromagnetic effects too, but they're not on the agenda, partly because actually they don't really know which indicators to look for or what to test or what would constitute harm. And so it's been complete, you know, as the English idiom, the British idiom would have it, they turn a complete blind eye to that and ignore it. It's narrowly framed on thermal effects. Another food example I like to give concerns emulsifiers as food additives. The assessment of the risks of emulsifiers has been narrowly framed strictly and exclusively in toxicological terms. Are the emulsifiers at the levels of use toxic to consumers? And for most of them, for the most part, the answer seems to be no. But that shouldn't be the end of the discussion. If you look at the composition of diets in industrialized countries and increasingly elsewhere in the world too, the proportion of food products consumed that consists of oils and fats has risen very substantially and is contributing to the high caloric input and growing levels of overweight and obesity. And those oils and fats are only present in the pizzas and the yogurts and chocolates and all the other products because of the role of emulsifiers. But that is not on the agenda. That is not included in the risk assessment. So, you know, what counts as a risk and what else gets discounted is absolutely vital. And also what counts as relevant evidence. Oh, we'll look at double-blind placebo studies, and we'll look at rodent studies that comply with OECD requirements. Oh, but we won't look at, what do they call them, anecdotal or case reports. So only certain kinds of evidence are deemed permissible and relevant, and others are excluded. Oh no, that's just anecdotal, that's not proper science. But might it raise some questions which deserve further inquiry? Don't ask, you know. So it's narrowly framed in terms of what's in the scope. So that's substantive risk assessment policy. Oh, this is procedural. It is, you know, how do you conduct your inquiries? I mean, one obvious answer is, do you do it is it open and accountable? I mean, the Food Standards Agency committees are in principle open, except when they're discussing gases used in riot control. But at the European Food Safety Authority, they're all behind closed doors. At the at the US Food and Drug Administration, at the Environmental Protection Agency, they're all behind closed doors. Indeed, the chief executive of the European Food Safety Authority said, it's really important that the meetings are behind closed doors so that the members of the committee can ask stupid questions. My response to that is, I don't mind if they ask stupid questions. I want to be sure they're asking intelligent questions. But, okay, but one of the good things that came out of the UK Food Standards Agency was the publication of this document, Report on the Review of the Committees, and it came up with, I think, an excellent piece of what I call procedural risk assessment policy. Advisory committees should ensure that the proceedings are properly documented. So there's a clear audit trail, and decisions should include an explanation of where differences of opinion have arisen during discussions and why conclusions have been reached, and they should explain any assumptions and uncertainties. I think that's terrific. It's just never been implemented. And if it was open and this procedural advice was followed, there would be far better science and far greater accountability. Okay, oh yes. Interpretive risk assessment policy, yeah. This is fine. Evidence never interprets itself, and the meaning of evidence is rarely self-evident, yeah. Implicit in all technology regulation, you have to make some assumption about what level of protection are you trying to achieve. I mean, there was a major step forward in the US in the 70s where the judgment, at least in principle, was we will deem intolerable a carcinogenic risk exceeding 1 extra case of cancer per million citizens, lifetime risk. And that was a very rare occasion when a level of protection was made explicit. Shame it wasn't followed, and most other countries haven't articulated a chosen level of protection, but it's always implicitly assumed. Yeah, how should uncertainties be addressed? Yeah, what do you prioritize, avoiding false positives or false negatives? And this is a crucial one. How much evidence and which kinds is variously necessary or sufficient to support decisions about whether you accept, reject, or restrict some product or process? There were always these implicit assumptions, which, yes, well, almost always they're left implicit, but maybe occasionally they're explicit. But these are all policy judgments that inform what's going on. The Codex Alimentarius is an organization essentially consisting of government representatives of all the members of the World Health Organization and UN Food and Agriculture Organization, which is essentially all the members of the United Nations, and it sets minimum safety standards for internationally traded food products. And they have acknowledged the existence of these political value assumptions that frame scientific risk assessment, and says determination of risk of policy is a specific component of risk management. So it shouldn't be the scientists who are doing the risk assessment who make these assumptions. They should be spelt out for them by risk managers in advance of the conduct of a risk assessment. They should come first, and they should be established in advance in consultation with the risk assessors, that's the arrows going both ways, and all other interested parties, such as industry and even consumers and public health representatives. and the mandate given by risk managers should be as clear as possible. I think that's a splendid bit of guidance. It's just never implemented. It was initially set up to apply to expert advisory committees advising the Codex Alimentarius Commission, and that was in 2007. And if I've got my dates right, in 2013, all the members of the Codex Committee, which is all the member states of the World Health Organization and the European Commission, all in principle committed themselves to implementing this, and none of them have ever done it. But if it had been followed, it would be much better. Okay. So as I say, in practice, most of these risk assessment policy issues are being decided by scientific advisors who are routinely portrayed as independent and objective, but in practice, they're closely aligned with industrial corporations. Okay. So let me just summarize, and I'm in relation to those three categories. Oh no, that's the wrong one, isn't it? Too many things to press, too many buttons to do. In relation to those three categories of risk assessment policy, I'm comparing what is the current orthodoxy, what is being said and what is being done in the second column, and what I think would be a socially and environmentally responsible way of doing it. So currently, substantive risk assessment policy judgments are narrow, minimal, and manageable. I think they should be broader, comprehensive, and often challenging. The procedural ones are currently closed, biased, and unaccountable. They should be open and accountable to both scientific and democratic scrutiny and oversight and accountability. The interpretive ones currently substantially prioritize corporate interests and highlight uncertainties and prioritize avoiding false negatives. I say they should be precautionary, they should acknowledge all policy relevant uncertainties and prioritize avoiding false negatives. And if these assumption, where's my battery? In the right-hand column are followed, then we would get, yes, then I think we would gain both better science and better policy. If the scientists want to say, oh no, we won't have anything to do with values or politics, then I say, then you cannot ever provide monolithic prescriptive advice. You can never say to a government or a commission, follow this course of action, follow that course of action. All you can do, or all you could do then, was to say, we can tell you what we know and don't know about the consequences of following or failing to follow a range of different policy options, but we can't tell you what to do. But given that that's not what policymakers want, if you want them to give specific advice and recommend specific courses of action, you have to make the values explicit and accountable. Yeah, okay. So if what I call the codynamic model, my fourth model, was explicitly implemented and those provisions implemented, then I think we would transform the science-based technology regulatory system into something that is both scientifically and democratically legitimate. But just finally, let me push my luck and try this. I have articulated an analysis of the distinctive kind of science which I call which many of us call regulatory science. But here's the challenge. Might it be the case that some of these value assumptions also inform non-regulatory science and, for example, academic science? When scientific researchers apply for research funds, typically what they do is respond to calls that are framed in a way that specifies which areas will be funded and, by implication, which areas will not be funded. And those choices presuppose certain value priorities and political and commercial interests. So maybe the value framing of scientific work, though critical in the regulatory field, is not only confined to the regulatory field. Thank you.